In 1914, a single bullet was fired in Sarajevo. One bullet. Within weeks, 30 nations were at war. Within 4 years, 20 million people were dead. Within a decade, the entire global economy had been reshaped, not just for the countries that fought, but for every nation on Earth that never fired a single shot. We tend to think of war as a military event. Soldiers, borders, territory. But that is not what war is. War is an economic earthquake, the most destructive economic event a civilization can produce. And the world we live in today, its prices, its debts, its hungers, and its inequalities, has been shaped more by wars than by any government, any policy, any invention. Today, we are going to talk about what actually happens when nations fight, not just to the countries in the fire, but to every country watching from the outside. Because here is the truth that nobody tells you. When 3 countries go to war, the whole world pays. Before we talk about economics, we need to talk about something more fundamental. We need to talk about the human brain. Because wars do not start in war rooms. They start in the brain, specifically in one small, ancient, extraordinarily powerful part of the brain called the reward system. The same system that drives addiction. The same system that makes a gambling addict keep pulling the lever long after they've lost everything. The same system that makes a person take one more drink when they know they shouldn't. Power activates the brain's reward circuitry in precisely the same way that cocaine does. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. When a leader gains power, their brain releases dopamine, the chemical of anticipation, of wanting, of craving, and like every addictive substance ever studied, the more power a person gets, the more their brain requires to feel the same level of satisfaction. The threshold keeps rising. The dose must increase. Research has found that high levels of dopamine produce something specific in powerful people, a sense of personal destiny, an immunity to risk, a deep, almost religious conviction that they are right and that history will vindicate them. Empathy decreases, impulse control weakens. Hitler, Stalin, Napoleon, history does not remember them as addicts, but the neurological profile fits. Wars start because the human brain, when given unchecked power, craves conquest the way an addict craves the next hit, not because it is rational, not because it is calculated, but because the neurochemistry of power makes rational calculation nearly impossible. And once the first missile flies, the economic consequences begin, not later, immediately. Let's imagine 3 countries. We'll call them Country A, Country B, and Country C. All 3 are real economies. They have farms and factories, banks and businesses, workers and families. Before the war, they trade with each other. They borrow from international markets. They build roads and schools and hospitals. Then, for reasons rooted in human psychology, in power, in nationalism, in fear, they go to war. The IMF and the World Bank have studied this across 135 wars in 115 countries over 75 years. The data is unambiguous. It is also devastating. On average, a country at war sees its real GDP fall by 13%, and there is no evidence of recovery, even a decade after the war begins. A decade of economic life erased, not temporarily, persistently. Think about what 13% of GDP means for a real person. It means businesses close. It means wages stop. It means the money that was supposed to go to teachers and doctors and roads now goes to weapons and walls and soldiers. Capital is a coward. It runs from uncertainty the moment it senses danger. When war breaks out, domestic investment falls by nearly 14%. Foreign investment evaporates overnight, and that capital does not return quickly. It waits, it watches, it judges stability, and stability, after war, takes years, sometimes generations, to rebuild. To pay for war, governments print money. They have no choice. The gap between what they earn and what they spend is bridged by one terrible mechanism: inflation. In countries at war, the price level rises by an average of nearly 50%, and that inflation persists for a decade after the war begins. 50% inflation does not sound like a number, so let me make it real. If your rent was $500 before the war, inflation makes it $750. If a bag of flour cost $1, it now costs $1.50. If your salary was 1,000 units of local currency, that salary now buys what 600 used to buy. Your savings, the money you worked years to accumulate, are quietly destroyed without anyone announcing it, without anyone declaring it, without a single bomb falling on your home. This is what inflation does. It is a silent tax on everyone who has ever worked and saved, and war unleashes it like a disease. When countries go to war, their most educated, most skilled, most capable citizens leave. Doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, programmers, the human capital that took decades to cultivate. The people who represent a nation's future get on planes and cross borders. And here is what makes this truly devastating. They rarely come back. Countries fighting on their own territory lose between 10 and 25% of their high-skilled workforce. Every engineer who leaves is an engineer who won't build the roads of reconstruction. Every doctor who flees is a doctor who won't treat the next generation. You can rebuild infrastructure, you can rebuild banks, you cannot easily rebuild human capital. That loss echoes across generations. There is one cost, almost never included in economic analysis. It belongs to the domain of psychology, yet it has profound economic consequences. War traumatizes populations, not just soldiers, entire nations. When a population lives under sustained fear, the constant threat of violence, the unpredictability of daily life, the loss of people they love, they develop what psychologists call scarcity mindset. They stop thinking about the future. They stop investing, stop planning, stop trusting institutions. They hoard rather than spend. They distrust rather than cooperate. Studies of post-conflict societies show elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and risk aversion that persist for 1, 2, sometimes 3 generations after a war ends. The psychological cost that economics never measures. Now let's step back. Zoom out. Countries A, B, and C are at war, but look at the map. They have neighbors, they have trading partners, countries who share borders, share rivers, share the routes along which goods and fuel and food travel every single day. These countries never declared war. Their soldiers are not dying, their cities are not on fire, but they are paying. Research across nearly 400 wars over 2 centuries shows that wars generate severe and lasting negative spillovers on neighboring economies. 5 years after the start of a war, neighboring countries see their GDP decline by almost 10% compared to where it would have been without the conflict. 10%. For doing nothing, for being unfortunate enough to share a border. Wars produce refugees, millions of them, and those refugees cross borders. They arrive in neighboring countries, desperate, exhausted, carrying nothing. Receiving countries must absorb millions of additional people rapidly. This strains housing, healthcare, schools, food supplies, and public finances. Simultaneously, modern economies run on trade. Goods flow constantly across borders, raw materials going one way, finished products the other. Oil, grain, steel, medicine, electronics. The global economy is a circulatory system, and trade is the blood. War is a clot. When countries A, B, and C go to war, the trade routes that pass through them become dangerous or impassable. Supply chains that took decades to build are severed overnight. If any of the three fighting countries sits on a critical energy artery, an oil field, a gas pipeline, a shipping strait, the effect on the global energy market is immediate and violent. This is not theoretical. Right now, in 2026, a conflict in the Middle East has disrupted the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil travels every single day. Oil prices have surged, gas prices have surged, fertilizer prices have surged by 35 to 40%, and those price shocks are being felt not in the countries fighting, but in Thailand, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa, countries that have nothing to do with the war, countries that woke up one morning and found that the cost of feeding their people had become suddenly, catastrophically, more expensive. Let's talk about something every human being on Earth needs every single day: food. Food does not grow from magic. It grows from seeds, planted in soil, nourished by fertilizer, harvested by machines that run on fuel, transported by trucks and ships and planes, and priced in markets that respond to supply and disruption. Every single one of those inputs is affected by war. The UN World Food Program warns that an additional 45 million people could be pushed into acute hunger from the current conflict alone. 45 million people, the entire population of a mid-sized country, pushed toward hunger, not by a drought, not by a failed harvest, but by a war between countries they have never seen, fought over disputes they were never part of. When energy prices rise, everything rises. Energy is not just fuel for cars. Energy is the input to almost every single thing that exists in a modern economy. It powers factories, it heats buildings, it runs the cold storage that keeps food from spoiling. It fuels the ships and trucks that move every product from where it is made to where it is needed. When energy prices spike, the price of everything else follows. When food becomes 20% more expensive, a rich country grumbles. When food becomes 20% more expensive, a poor country starves. Here is the part that should disturb you most. Not everyone loses from war. Research studying 190 countries over 44 years found something remarkable and troubling. While developing countries are economically devastated by conflicts, most high-income countries, particularly those in North America and Europe, actually benefit economically from their participation in violence fought on other people's soil. Countries that fight wars far from home benefit from domestic military spending, weapons factories running at full capacity, employment in defense industries, government contracts flowing, while suffering none of the physical destruction. Arms sales by the world's largest weapons manufacturers have doubled in real terms over the past 2 decades. Every war that breaks out somewhere is an opportunity for someone, somewhere far from the fire, to profit. The war ends. A ceasefire is signed. The world exhales. But the economics of war do not end with the war. The economic scars of war are large, persistent, and multidimensional. Real GDP shows no evidence of recovery, even a decade after the onset of war. Not 5 years, not 8 years, a decade. Governments fund wars, primarily by borrowing and by printing money. Both mechanisms create obligations that survive the conflict by decades. After World War I, Germany was saddled with reparations debt so crushing that it helped destroy the Weimar Republic and gave rise to the political conditions that made World War II possible. The compound interest of war debt is another form of ongoing damage, an invisible tax paid by people who were born after the bombs stopped falling. Children raised in post-war economies inherit the psychological imprint of that war without having experienced it directly. Research shows that children whose parents lived through conflict display higher rates of risk aversion, lower rates of entrepreneurship, reduced trust in institutions, and diminished economic ambition. The trauma passes through families, through the stories told or not told at dinner tables, through the anxiety carried in the body of a parent who grew up during bombardment, through the scarcity mindset that treats every period of stability as temporary and not to be trusted. A country's economy is its people, and when its people carry the weight of war in their neurology, the economy carries that weight too. Let me give you the numbers, not to overwhelm you, but because facts matter. Across 115 conflicts studied in 145 countries over 75 years, real GDP falls by 13% on average. For some conflicts, it exceeds 30% within 5 years. Investment collapses by nearly 14%. Household consumption, the standard of living for ordinary families, falls by 11%. Government revenue drops by 14%, while military spending holds steady or increases. Price levels rise by nearly 50% and remain elevated for at least a decade. Currency loses value by over 100% on average. Neighboring countries see their GDP decline by almost 10% within 5 years. Global GDP would have been 12% higher since 1970 if there had been no violent conflict. For 7 countries, including Iraq and Afghanistan, total GDP would have more than doubled in the absence of violent conflict since 1970. The IMF found that wars cause output losses that typically exceed those associated with financial crises or severe natural disasters. Wars are worse for an economy than financial crises. Wars are worse for an economy than the most severe natural disasters. And they are entirely human-made. Entirely human-made. The most destructive economic force in human history, built by humans, for humans, against humans. Behind every number in this video is a human life, not a data point, not a statistic, a life. A child in Bangladesh whose parents cannot afford fertilizer for their crops because a war started in a country they could not find on a map. That child's nutrition, their education, their future, shaped by forces entirely beyond their control, beyond their understanding. They did not choose this. Nobody asked them. Nobody warned them. One morning, the price of food simply became impossible, and a child's future quietly changed direction, not because of anything they did, but because somewhere far away, 2 men with power and dopamine in their brains decided the world was theirs to break. A family in a fighting country, their savings erased by inflation, without a single official announcement. The thread of their economic life, the years of work, the careful saving, the small plans for a slightly better future, dissolved by the neurochemistry of a distant leader's dopamine addiction. A young person in a neighboring country who cannot find work because investment fled and businesses closed, and the job that was supposed to exist doesn't. The thread of their ambition, their hope, their contribution, cut short by a war they never voted for. Understanding this does not stop wars, but refusing to understand it, that ignorance has a cost. The cost is measured. The world is not a collection of separate nations, each sealed in its own consequences. It is a single, interconnected system, economic, psychological, biological, in which the decisions of the powerful land on the bodies of the powerless, in which a leader's dopamine addiction becomes a Bangladesh farmer's empty field, in which 3 countries' war becomes 45 million people's hunger. This is what lachesis measures, not just the life of one person, the thread of the whole human story. And right now, in 2026, as you watch this, that thread is being pulled tighter. Pay attention.